Can a country be obsessed with a planet? This seems to be absolutely true for the Soviet Union and Venus. But why was this nation so crazy about a planet that is actually considered a boiling hell? What did the Soviets really want on Venus? Recent revelations unveil shocking experiences and previously unknown details of the most extraordinary space mission of all time. From the 1960s to the 1980s, the Soviets obsessively launched 16 probes towards Venus. Many of them failed, and the cost of increasingly better probes and new technologies was immense. During the Cold War, money was not an issue. It was a ruthless arms race that extended to space. The scientists of the former Soviet Union could not afford to fail, launching probes almost every month. The Soviet Union created a myth with the exploration of Venus and provided unique images of one of the strangest planets we know. Imagine how difficult it must have been in the 1960s to build probes capable of withstanding temperatures of over 450 degrees Celsius and pressures equivalent to the weight of 90 jumbo jets on your fingers. Engineers skillfully worked the most advanced cameras into thick layers of insulating and protective materials. The result was images that amazed the world. It's truly incredible how determined the Soviet Union was to land on Venus. The mission sparked much speculation at the time. What were the Soviets intending to do on Venus? And why Venus? Out of a total of 16 probes sent to Venus, 8 missed the target, disappeared, or failed. Despite this, the Soviets continued to launch one probe after another towards the planet from the 1960s to the 1980s, presumably investing hundreds of millions of dollars in the projects. Was it really just scientific curiosity driving the Soviets, or was there something else behind this obsession? Venus was particularly interesting because it is similar to Earth in size and mass. Traditionally, Venus was often referred to as Earth's twin planet. However, today we know that its conditions are completely different from those of our home planet. The impenetrable layers of clouds on Venus concealed the planet's surface, and for a long time, no one knew what Venus really looked like beneath this layer. The motivation of the Soviets was not only scientific. The Venera missions were also part of an incessant geopolitical competition between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Every success in space also meant a political victory. Everyone wanted to demonstrate their absolute technological superiority. In practice, the Venera mission was a kind of technological arm wrestling for the Soviet Union. Researchers already knew that Venus was hot and poisonous. Only the best had to succeed in landing on this extreme planet. After the United States provided the first data from Venus with the Mariner 2 mission in 1962, the world was shocked. Hot, poisonous, and with pressure that could crush a human being, Venus was considered impossible to explore, and the Soviets exploited this scientific shock to show the world who was the most fearless and powerful force on Earth. Venera 7 successfully landed on Venus. It must have been a crazy time when probes were launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome almost every month. Naturally, at the time, the Soviets kept failed missions secret. This sensitive data became public only after the opening of the East and the fall of the Soviet Union. You have to imagine that at the time, the Soviet Union released only strictly censored information, and obviously only the best and most successful ones. The country had to demonstrate its power and superiority, and admitting that Venera 2 and Venera 4 had simply flown away or disappeared would have been tantamount to defeat. The first successful landings on Venus were reported by the international press with Venera 7. The Soviets achieved the impossible and showed the United States their technological superiority. It was 1970 when the Cold War and the space race were in full swing. The United States had landed on the Moon in 1969, and the Soviet Union naturally had to counter this phenomenon with the first landing on a planet, and moreover, on Venus. The Soviet Union managed to score a hit with Venera 9. The Soviet Union did more, and in 1975, the transmission of data from Venus to Earth worked for the first time. The nation proudly announced that it had the first accurate data on the surface of Venus and some blurred images. Anyone who thinks these successes were the culmination of the missions is mistaken. This was just the beginning and the incentive to build more probes that would withstand the harsh conditions of Venus longer and provide even more data. USA versus Soviets, the War of the Worlds, East versus West, a war between superpowers. After World War II, the victorious Western powers and Russia split. After the October Revolution in Russia, a communist regime developed under the leadership of the Soviet Union. The ideological differences between capitalist West and communist East led to deep mistrust and a policy of isolation and confrontation. The period following World War II was an era of tension. The East and the West engaged in a technological arms race, and the space race was one of the most fascinating and intense periods of the Cold War. Although this era made many fear a new war, the extreme competition led humanity to revolutionary technological advancements and spectacular space missions. The space race officially began on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union surprised the United States by launching Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. This success triggered a massive reaction in the United States. There were fears of espionage from space, not only in the United States. This led to the rapid establishment of their own space agency called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA for short. In the early years of the race, the Soviet Union was ahead. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth aboard Vostok 1. This triumph was another slap from Russia to the United States. The Soviet Union celebrated the day as a great propaganda victory, and Gagarin became a superstar. 2 years later, on June 16, 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space, and the Soviets scored another major success. The United States reacted, and President John F. Kennedy announced the imminent landing of Americans on the Moon. This goal was achieved on July 20, 1969, with the Apollo 11 mission, and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the Moon, becoming heroes just like Yuri Gagarin. To the great disappointment of the Soviet Union, during that period, the United States also achieved other important successes in space. The Mariner programs had provided the first detailed images of Mars and Venus, although they were flyby photos and not from the surface. After the missions, the US government and NASA announced their intention to send the first lander to Mars. The Soviets chose Venus as their goal and portrayed the United States as too cowardly to explore this inhospitable place. Shortly after the success of the first Venera missions, the United States landed on Mars. On July 20, 1976, Viking 1 was the first man-made spacecraft to land on Mars, sending detailed photos and scientific data from the Red Planet. One of the lesser-known details of this period is that there was also cooperation in space. American and Soviet spacecraft were docked in 1975 as part of the Apollo-Soyuz test project, resulting in a historic handshake in space. Venera 13 and 14, the pinnacle of Venus madness. Even today, engineers marvel at the technology that in the 1970s was able to tackle a place with temperatures over 450 degrees Celsius and a pressure of 90 Earth atmospheres. After the first Venera mission successfully demonstrated that it was possible to land on Venus and send data, the Soviets naturally wanted to go further. The Venera 13 and 14 missions became flagship missions with high-quality camera systems on board. Venera 13 provided the first color photos of the enchanting hell of Venus when it landed on March 1, 1982. Venera 13 was equipped for the first time with a camera capable of taking color photos, a first for Venus and a major step forward in space exploration. Venera 13 landed successfully and immediately began collecting data. The probe not only sent the first color photos of the surface of Venus but also detailed analyses of soil samples. The images showed a rocky, inhospitable landscape with flat stones and a thin layer of sand. The colors of Venus's surface, a reddish-orange hue, were as impressive as the realization that these images were taken by a probe that landed on a planet as hot as hell and over 40 million kilometers away. A small inconvenience was the inability to fully extend the camera, leaving the panoramic images incomplete. But the triumph was not long in coming. The exercise continued a few days later with Venera 14. The next probe landed on March 5, 1982, and Venera 14 achieved the unthinkable. Color panoramic images of Venus with such clarity and detail that even today scientists consider these images among the best in space research. One of the highlights of this mission was a new drilling system specially developed to take and analyze even more soil samples. While Venera 13 performed solidly, Venera 14 had a small but crucial problem. The drill extended perfectly but then landed on one of the camera lens caps that had just fallen off instead of the ground. Nevertheless, the panoramic images and scientific discoveries of the Venera probes became a legend of space travel and a proud legacy of the Soviet Union. Even decades later, the panoramic images taken by Venera 13 and 14 have not lost their charm. The photos showed Venus in all its harsh beauty, a world of cracked rocks and rugged landscapes lying under a thick orange haze. These images not only fascinate us but are still a real delight for scientists, who gain valuable information about geological processes and the planet's surface from the formations and types of rock. Venera 13 and 14 were the last successful Soviet missions to Venus. Even today, a series of myths and legends surround the images. According to some insiders, the Soviet Union published only some of the images from that time. The secret images that would show shadows and mysterious movements on the surface of Venus are still under strict surveillance today. Subscribe to the channel now and wait for new exciting videos.